We have two amazing people who are going to be presenting today. To start off, Simon. He's a modern um, social entrepreneur who works in the nonprofit sector. He's taken the principles of the mission and applied them to his work with the Center of Transformational Practice, White River Junction in Vermont. Might also recognize him from the book Thought Revolution. Alongside him, we have Hannah. Um, she's from Long Island, New York. She's an alumni of GGKLI. She has gone and got her bachelor's of science in earth science and policy at Penn State, and she's currently pursuing her master's at Johns Hopkins, studying environmental planning and management. Take it away, guys.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I really appreciate being invited to join into this camp in this way. Hannah, we haven't discussed which one of us will do the screen share. Do you want me to advance the slides?
Sure, that'd be great.
Okay, let's see what happens here. Going to. Okay. So as we had planned, Hannah, you can lead us off.
Sure. So today me and Simon are going to be talking about the climate crisis in a couple different dimensions. And how we're going to be doing this is kind of switching back and forth based on our specific expertise. So Simon, if you want to go to the next slide. Thanks. So what do we know about climate change? As time has gone on, global temperatures have risen due to the excess of carbon emissions. The production of carbon emissions traps heat in the atmosphere while at the same time creating a hole in the ozone layer. This has severe consequences for every aspect of our everyday life. These changes will start on a small scale and have a chain reaction that will affect life as we know it. For example, due to climate change and warming temperatures, crops have been severely affected by changing temperature. This has made it a lot harder for certain species of plants to survive, limiting the biodiversity of plants, in which turn can severely affect the supply chain of crops in our everyday supermarkets. Climate change has caused the melting of the ice caps already, which has huge effects on rising sea level. Over 80% of our US population lives in coastal or coastal adjacent areas. A sea level rise of even 2 feet, which is projected to occur by 2050, could entirely wipe out several homes and destroy cities as we know it. As the climate crisis worsens and temperatures continue to rise, wildfires become more common, ravaging land and people's homes and towns. While some of these processes are entirely natural, they have been dramatically worsened due to the human anthropogenic causes. If we as humans address these changes on a large scale, we have the capacity to lessen the degree of damage to the overall issue. While some of these effects are easier addressed on a larger policy scale, there are so many things that we can do in our everyday lives to prevent these damages. So in this slide, I have some statistic on what I was talking about before with the sea level rise impacts on Long Island. And these are just some projections based on the way our carbon emissions have been looking in the last 10 to 15 years and longer term trends. You can see in the bottom picture that, because I'm from Long Island, I decided to use my area as an example, but you can see that most of the island is actually projected to be at least somewhat underwater, and coastal areas, you know, most people living on Long Island are living on the beach or on the water. So this could displace several hundreds of thousands of people. And then the picture on the left is a picture I took when I lived out west, and wildfires were very common there. And it kind of puts into perspective that people experience these effects of climate change on completely different scales. Out west, they might be impacted by wildfires. On the East Coast, on Long Island, sea level rise. And these effects are often disproportionate. They may affect lower income communities more, or smaller countries that are doing the least to contribute to the overall crisis. So here's a statistic that I thought was pretty interesting. The current atmospheric carbon parts per million is 409.8. And then as we can see in this picture, that the change in temperature in the last, I think that's 20 years, has risen, yeah, since 1900 is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. That might not seem like a big increase, but that has a variety of impacts on several things, as I just mentioned earlier. Some of the emission scenarios for 2050 and onwards are pretty bleak. It really does depend on our everyday efforts to reduce our emissions, and that's on a global scale. It's not just, you know, unique to the United States or any, even though the United States is a very big producer of carbon emissions, it falls on the world to take steps to reduce carbon emissions, to reduce the amount of increase in temperature.
So this is a picture that Hannah is painting here is a picture of a real time of emergency in human history. And I know that you all are aware of that, and probably some of you may know quite a bit about it, but I think it's also valuable to keep it in the forefront about what is the reason for the level of concern. And one of the aspects that is really quite scary is this notion of feedback loops. A feedback loop, Anna, we're going to come back to your slide there. Sorry, Joe, my apologies. A feedback loop is something that is self-accelerating. So it's an aspect which, once the temperature of the planet heats, it sets in motion certain dynamics which further accelerate that heating. So for instance, one of those feedback loops that is discussed a lot is the melting of the polar ice caps leads to a situation where the North and South poles are less reflective and more absorbent of heat. So then the more it heats, then the more it increases. And another major one is methane that is trapped in the permafrost layer in the tundra and northern hemisphere. And as that permafrost melts, the methane is released. Those types of things. The same thing is true for the carbon that's trapped in ice caps. And similar feedback loops pertain to temperature of the ocean, acidity of the ocean, and et cetera. These cumulatively all also impact one another in unpredictable ways. Back to you, Hannah.
Yeah, so this graphic is actually one of the most iconic climate change related graphs ever created. And it shows that over time, the temperature has fluctuated, you know, since as far back as we can understand. And some always argue, oh, we went through an ice age, you know, global warming isn't real. But it's this graph that really puts it into perspective. As you can see on the red part towards the end of the graph, that is due to human carbon emissions related temperature increase. So historically, before humans had come into the industrial era, there was no emissions being produced, and you can match up that exact timeline to when we started industry and smokestacks and all of that.
I'm going to jump off of share screen just to ask a question of people. So Hannah talked about global parts per million of carbon and talked about temperature increase, the numbers being 408.9 and also approximately 1.8 degrees of temperature Fahrenheit increase. How many people here are totally familiar with those numbers? Is that all well-trod territory for everybody? Can you just sort of nod if you've been engaged in that dialogue before? Cool. Okay. So anyway, 108 and 1.8 408 and 1.8 are super important numbers to be aware of in terms of where we're at historically. This was, by the way, has all been mentioned and predicted in the writings of Gurudev. And the notion of our current era as being an era characterized by emergency is also definitely a recurrent theme. So another dimension of this that's a little bit less talked about is what we could call ecological overshoot. And the concept of ecological overshoot, even though it's less discussed, it's actually less scientifically controversial than atmospheric carbon. And it is the notion that we have a certain number of ecologically productive acres, or we could say hectares, on the planet, and we have a certain amount of certain amount of land, ecologically productive land, to produce everything that we consume. And you can measure this in terms of an individual, you can measure it in terms of an individual object, let's say a cup of coffee or a computer, or you can measure it in terms of a community or a country or the planet as a whole. And I just focus on the last one, the planet as a whole. Let's see here. Because I went off share screen for some reason, now all of a sudden I can't control the slides. Let's see what's going on here. Okay, go back to share screen. Okay, so the you all can see the slide, but I can't advance it. Wonder why that is. Something glitchy just happened, but let's just see if I go back into it from present mode. Yes, okay. So ecological, if you add up the amount of global hectares it takes to supply all of the goods that and consumables that humankind as a whole is consuming, it comes out to 22.4 billion global hectares. There are at this time only 12.2 billion global hectares of land on the planet. And so what that means is that we have a global factor of overshoot of 1.85. In other words, to supply all of the activities that are currently taking place on planet Earth, we would need 1.85 planet Earths. And you might ask yourself, how is it possible to call upon 1.8 planet Earths when we have only one planet Earth? And the answer is the same as for your bank account. You have to borrow from the future. So we borrow from the future in terms of fertility and in terms of various different forms of disruption. So this is a really, really important dimension, the number, in addition to 408 and 1.8 degrees, 1.85 for a global overshoot. That's also very important. All of these point to reduction of consumption in one way or another, or you could say reduction of emissions of greenhouse gases. A lot of this comes down to the particles that float around in the atmosphere. This is an interesting map that I just recommend people check out. This is the global creditors and debtors on planet Earth. All of the ones that are tinted towards the redder are people who are consuming more than their land mass is producing. And all of the bluer ones are countries that are producing less than theirs are producing. And it's interesting just to point out here, even though the country of India is a light shade of pink, it's a little bit misleading because actually, if you factor out the way in which the average resident of India is living, it is within the carrying capacity of the planet. If you divide per capita of the planet, the US actually would be approximately 5 times that. And there's some countries, UK, et cetera, maybe even more so. But the basic sort of takeaway from this is that there are people on planet Earth that are living within the carrying capacity, and there are people on planet Earth that are far outstripping the carrying capacity. And to live in a socially just way, we'd all want to bring our consumption in alignment with what the planet could sustain if everyone lived that way. So that is actually the kind of life which is fairly austere and recommended, was sort of taught as a simple living, high thinking lifestyle that's taught within the Gayatri Parivar. So I just wanted to mention that kind of coherence. So we've been talking about climate change and the climate crisis in terms of the material conditions. And as we shift over to look a little bit more deeply at some of the spiritual dimensions of the climate crisis, I don't want to undercut any of the work that's being done in geopolitical, political, infrastructure, technology, legal realms. All of these realms are absolutely essential to human survival, and they're all totally perfect. Totally important, and need to ramp up in many ways. However, there is, I do want to just suggest that there is a spiritual dimension of the collective consciousness in various countries and on planet Earth as a whole that could be considered the foundation of all of these other forms of more materially oriented work. Why is it the foundation? Why can we find the foundation of this conundrum in the realms of consciousness? I think that we can look back to philosophical, cosmological traditions that emanate from India for that. This here quote for me at the end of the revival of Satyag: mind is the state of mind is the origin and creator of all circumstances. This is Gurudev quoting the Maitrani Upanishads, and he emphasizes this point further. This truth should be understood 1,000 times and explained 1,000 more. The state of mind is the origin and creator of all circumstances. This essential cosmology philosophy, we could call it kind of Vedantic philosophy, or perhaps Vedic philosophy, was also emphasized by Gautama Buddha, who in verse 1 of book 1, verse 1 of the Dhammapada says, mind, all phenomena are mind made. This is the first line of the Dhammapada, very, very heavily emphasized point. So if you have this kind of philosophy, which is sort of a philosophical foundation for Gayatri Parivar thought, you have to conclude that our climate crisis also is mind-made. And this point is brought forward in this book, Revival of Satyag, quite a bit in terms of the how this insight applies to our social, I'm dropping my mouse here, but our work towards social change, and is to some extent the focus or the basic foundation of our basic project of thought revolution, Vichar Kranti. At the end of the book, Gurudev emphasizes this point in a slightly different way. It's a very similar point. It is the level of our consciousness that creates the unfavorability of circumstances within which we now live. So this is talking specifically about level of consciousness, which I think is also a really important thing to unpack. And the basic way I'm thinking about level of consciousness is you can speak about this in many, many different ways. But one way that has been handy for me, particularly when I'm speaking to audiences that are less rooted in a profound spiritual tradition, is to think about the level of conventional consciousness in which we more or less identify ourselves as material beings living within a material world, and the transition from this perspective to the recognition of the interconnectedness of life and the deeper levels of radical unity of all creation at deeper levels of consciousness. This is you could call this paradigm shift. You could call it transformation of consciousness. You could call it Vichar Kranti or thought revolution. But whatever it is, this particular transition in outlook and the commensurate or accompanying deepening of consciousness within the spectrum of our own being is essential to all the work that we're doing with regards to climate change. And this point is kind of emphasized here at the end. It says, whether a person cultivates benefit or harm for oneself and for the world depends solely on the depth of his or her desires and ambitions. This is if we apply this insight directly to the work that we're going to be thinking about with regards to reducing our own consumption, it is clear that this is foundational on a person-to-person level and also on a countrywide level and a global level as well to our ability to reduce consumption. We can make this point in a whole bunch of different ways. But the two ways that I just want to emphasize right now, one has to do with what we could call our relationship with the present moment. And I want to throw out the idea that conventional mind has an uneasy relationship with the present moment and is ultimately uncomfortable with the moment that is now. Always looking for some way to escape this. And one of the ways to escape it, the primary ways to escape it, involves some form of consumption, therefore some form of carbon emission. So it's renovate the kitchen, it's travel to take a vacation for 2 weeks in some other place, go somewhere, purchase something, acquire something. All of these things are modes of forming achieving our gratification by means of our engagement in the outside world. This is part of the motor of the consumptive lifestyle, which is constantly trying to resolve the need for the next fix, which is ultimately based in our relationship with the present moment and perhaps a sense of unease with nothing happening, nothing changing. So that's one point. And the other one that I hinted on is this fundamental question about where does the sources of gratification come from? Where does my sense of satisfaction come from? Perhaps it comes from something on the outside of myself. Perhaps it comes from within. So we could say ultimately that the fundamental belief of conventional mind is that our gratification comes from the outside, whereas the deeper truth that enlightened mind is able to recognize is that no, actually gratification comes from within. That is to say, our deeper sense of well-being, our deeper sense of satisfaction. So in those two ways, we can see this connection between what we could call transformation of consciousness and our ability to make the changes now that our planet is crying out for. Let me see what we're looking at here. Yes, over to you, Hannah.
Okay, I just wanted to start out by asking you guys, do you generally feel that you live a sustainable lifestyle? You can just nod or unmute, whatever's easier. Okay. And then why would you guys say that you do? What are some things that you do?
I'd say doing the things on this list right now.
What'd you say, Rohan?
I'd say at least trying to do some of these things on this list right now.
Well, that's good.
So
okay.
Very bad at shorter showers, but at least, reusing bags, vegetarian diet, walking / biking more often, etc.
Okay, good. That's great. Yeah, I know that a lot of these things are a lot more palatable than, what you might imagine in being a more eco-friendly person. So like starting on the list, going down, reducing single-use plastic. This is such a big one. I mean, every time you go get a coffee from Starbucks, that you can't really recycle that plastic. People think you can recycle that plastic, but it can't be recycled. So I know because of COVID, it's really hard to bring your own cup anywhere. I'm pretty sure they don't allow that still. But going forwards, when things start to be lifted, I would highly recommend it. You even get a discount at Starbucks when you bring your own cup. So, and Dunkin' too, Dunkin' Donuts, you get. So I would definitely try to reduce packaging as well. So like when you go to a store and there's an option to get your produce unpackaged, that's an example of a sustainable decision you can make in your everyday life. Or like going to the farmers market, shopping local is really important. It reduces the emissions produced in produce traveling. Like a lot of people don't know that our produce comes from all over, and those emissions are not talked about enough. And I feel like I only even know about that because I studied this in school. Like there's so many little things that we do every day that we just have no idea um, of the impact. So I personally have been trying to go to the farmer's market to get as much of my produce as possible. I would recommend trying to find that nearby. Um, so again, with the single-use plastic, it could be something as small as bringing your own utensils with you when you are going out to eat, or not to like a sit down restaurant, but like Chipotle. It's the little plastic. It's not just straws that people don't think about enough. I personally have like a travel set of utensils that I'll bring with me, and I'll bring my own Tupperware to cut down on the single use packaging for takeout and things like that. And people our age, I mean, it pretty much everything you do, you drink or eat is in single use plastic. So once you start being cognizant of the fact that, oh my gosh, the Starbucks cup is plastic, and then you start seeing it everywhere you go. So it's like really, really important to start thinking smarter about what you're buying. Um, and then for shorter showers, I know a lot of people aren't gonna like this one, but there's a lot of emissions produced in the waste of, well, using water in general, but also it's not sustainable to take advantage of water this way. And we've seen water crises in the past, and we're lucky here in North America in general that we don't really have the question of, are we going to be able to have clean water to drink every day? So I like to practice what I preach, and I promise you guys that I try to do all of these. But this, something that I found works for me advocating for this, is have a shower playlist of like 2 4-minute songs. So then once you listen to 2 of the songs, you have to get out of the shower. So I like to use that one. That one's a good little tip. Okay, yeah, going off of that, repurposing what you own. Everyone's moms do this with the yogurt container. It's so easy to just take anything that you have at home and keep using it for like another couple of months or years. That plastic can be recycled obviously too, but it's better to repurpose it into like a planter or something. Again, with the yogurt container, that I've used that as like a pot, like a flower pot, and you can make it look nice and paint it. But the purpose of me mentioning this is that there's better solutions than throwing everything in the garbage. You can get creative and save money. And being our age, you don't always have a lot of money to buy new things all the time. So it's good to do this. And then going off of talking about trash, we all need to look at the recycling laws in our areas, because I've lived in a lot of different places now, and they're different everywhere. And the same things can't be recycled in the same places. In New York, for example, you can put all of your plastic, glass, everything in one bin, and then they just do it for you. But in Pennsylvania, you had to know exactly what plastic plastic 1 through 6 can be recycled, and plastic number 8 can't be. So a lot of people don't know, but if there's any, and they call it, I think it's like tampering or something of the trash, then they'll throw it all in the landfill. So it's like, it's really, really important to know exactly what can and can't be recycled, and to try your hardest to do that and look into that. And it might be easy where you can just put everything into one garbage can on recycling day and then it's done for you. But also cleaning out your recycling, you need to, like, let's say you get sour cream or something, like a sour cream container, you need to wash that out. Otherwise they will also just throw that in the landfill too. But even better than having to recycle, like Simon was talking about, cutting down on consumption, and where, you know, being an American, it's all about consumerism, and that's obviously the larger problem. And we have such an addiction to buying things off of Amazon, or having like instant gratification of, oh, I want this, I can have it in the mail, but we don't think about the emissions produced and those things traveling to whatever location we are at, and the packaging involved in that. And the upkick in online ordering during COVID probably offset or caused the same amount of emissions that people would have emitted in transportation. I think it's going to be really interesting to see the statistics on that, but people don't think about when they order something that it has any consequence. So I've just been really cognizant of that going, like, in my life. I try so hard not to buy off Amazon. I try to get things locally. And that goes with clothing too. A lot of girls buy their clothes on the internet because it's cheap, and I mean, it's much cheaper than in person, but there's a lot that goes on behind that that's very unsustainable. Like, again, the packaging and the amount of emissions produced in that traveling to wherever you are. And also sometimes it's worth looking into these companies to check out their labor laws and see if it's child labor behind some of this fast fashion. That's a different topic, but it goes along with sustainability and being really mindful of your purchases. And something going off of being mindful of your purchases, I like to support companies that give back to the environment. And that's an easier one, I think, to follow for me. It's like, if I'm giving a company my money, I want to make sure that they're doing something good with it. And that's a little one. Like, for Patagonia, for example, is a very expensive clothing brand, but they do so much good that I find it worth it to put money into that. And also, a lot of clothing brands like Patagonia will have incentives where you can bring your clothes in, like a lifetime warranty essentially. And so sometimes it's better to spend a little bit more money on things like that to be sustainable. And then, you know, being a vegetarian, a lot of people don't realize, beyond religious beliefs and cultural beliefs, how much being a vegetarian helps the environment. So many carbon emissions are produced in eating meat. The process of even cultivating livestock, them eating, you know, cows eating grains, that actually produces methane, which is a really harmful gas to the ozone layer. So it's not even about not eating meat culturally, it's about the bigger impacts of that. And being vegetarian is still even better than being vegan. You don't need to go vegan. Veganism actually there's a lot of controversy behind that, because the alternative products a lot of like vegan brands have is also unsustainable as well. Like oat milk is not good for the environment. And I mean, there's just so much that goes behind this, but my point is that being a vegetarian is really good for the environment. Yeah, but that's just like a couple things that I feel like for people our age is probably easier to do than other things. So
I wanted to follow up on what Hannah said by looking at this list and other lists that we're all aware of in terms of our experience of doing these activities, and also our experience of seeing others that are diligent with these activities. And I want to confess something to you, that there's a part of me that feels pinched by these activities, and also responds slightly negatively on occasion when I see other people doing them. It's a confession that I want to share with you, but I think that I'm not alone in that, because there's a way in which a lot of these activities, which I think are all great, all great aspirations and really great things to work towards and to achieve, have in them a little bit of stepping away from the mainstream, stepping away from society, particularly, let's say, not ordering from Amazon, or not hopping in the car every time you need to go places, or bringing your own bags, these types of things. There's a way in which you're not really participating in this massive flow of consumption, which sort of dominates activities. To some extent, in that way, they do a little bit undermine structures of ego. And that's the thing that I wanted to highlight, is that the benefits of engaging these activities as a practice in itself, which can be part of your spiritual practice, is a really interesting dimension of our current conundrum. It relates with I want to share another quote that I'm imagining this quote was said by Gurudev I know it was in 1980, at Shantikunj, maybe in that great hall. It was just a lecture that he was giving, and he was talking about 4 different pillars of Jivan Sadhana. One of the pillars is Sanyam, which could be translated as restraint, or discipline. And Jivan Sadhana means that your spiritual practice is woven into your life. And so he said that one of the four, he says, Jivan Sadhana is a sadhana of self-restraint, also known as Sanyam, in which the maximum is saved and the minimum is spent on one's own sustenance. Inasmuch time, labor, money, and talents needed to ensure the simple, dignified life standard of an average citizen are to be used in one's person and family. So here, when he says average citizen, I'm pretty sure he's not talking about the average American citizen. He's talking about the average citizen living in the villages in India. That is largely his audience. And we know from the previous graph that we looked at that the average citizen in India is living on 1.1 global hectares of land, whereas, which is approximately 1/10 the average consumption of a Westerner. So what's being suggested here as one of the pillars of Jivan Sadhana is very, very radical with regards to lifestyle. You can look up on charts what the current average citizen in India is, what level they're consuming. And that's all well documented. In 1980, we can imagine it might have been quite a bit less than that. But whatever it is, if you can imagine, cutting your current consumption down by a factor of 5, that seems to me what's being suggested here. Very, very, very high aspiration. But at the very least, we can take from this comparison this idea that those little things that we implement in our own life are part of our sadhana. That is to say, part of what we do to bring about our own inner transformation. Hannah, I'm going to hand it back to you now.
Yeah, so I wanted to show you guys, when I went to Shantikunj 2 years ago, I was lucky enough for them to take me all around and to look at some of the ways that they practice sustainability. And it's amazing that at DSVV that they're able to to make and recycle their own paper. And they do that for the entire university. And I just wanted to show you guys that they do practice what they preach there. They do so much, even the rainwater harvesting. That's another, that was so interesting to me, that they're able to use the rain that comes in and filter that out so people can drink it. I just thought that was really cool.
These yellow sheets here that are hanging on the banister, and then are also down here as part of a big paper making production where they turn, that's incredibly beautiful to see. And then all of that paper gets turned into bags.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, they also do composting there. They do they have like really big fields where they compost things. Trying to think what else they had there.
I think they have, I heard Tinmiji say it somewhere, like one of the world's first real successful biodigester plants where they produce their, probably not all, but most of their own electricity from human and animal waste.
Yeah, I think there's a point someone talked about 2 or 3 years back when I was at Shantikunj that they have a world-class, like, I think waste management system or something like that. Or like, I mean, world-class in the sense as like very effective, not, pretty looking the way that we would see on, a Western factory or something, but and it's a simple and effective, means of capturing human waste and, not having that just thrown into the environment.
Yeah, I saw that. It was like a giant circular like barrel. It didn't smell very nice, but it was pretty interesting to see.
Hannah, should I jump in?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay. So I think that might be bringing the points that we wanted to share with you around full circle, and basic gist of it, as I've come to understand, is we were in an emergency time, as has been stated, and that is being made undoubtedly clear by the frontiers of science, even in ways that are more dire than the news is willing to tell us. It's so scary. We're not even trusted with the actual full dimension of it. And part of the proper human response to this time is to find ways to consume less of the planet and to send fewer greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. And that part of the foundation of this is the transformation of consciousness to allow for these activities to take place. You could say this thought revolution that we are working towards, and that on the basis of that we can engage the lifestyle of the future and create the culture of the future. Any closing remarks from your side?
Yeah, going off of what Simon just said, it's so important for us, especially as a younger generation that takes this issue, I think, at least more seriously than maybe those older than us. It's really, really important for us to act in our actions and in our thoughts. And like again, what Simon said, I don't think anyone understands how urgent this is. This needs to be addressed, and it can't wait any longer. And if we do, if we don't act, then I guarantee you the world that our children will one day live in will not look anything like how it does today. And because people don't know what that might be like or don't know what's to come, they can't comprehend how dire this is. And seeing the numbers, seeing the facts, seeing the data, it can be a lot. It can be depressing, but people just don't, there's not enough awareness on the subject. And I really wish that everyone had to take a class on this in college or high school, or this is more integrated into our educational system. but I cannot emphasize enough how we need to take this seriously. And I know that we also all might feel that, you know, this is a bigger issue than us as an individual, but I hope this presentation has been enough of a bump to knowing that we can still do something about this on our personal scale. Yeah, but if you guys have any questions, you can ask them now. So
I had a question for, I guess, both of you. And I think and you've, like, through your presentation, you've painted, I think, a very clear picture about obviously how dire the need is, like you were just saying, Hannah. And I guess maybe from your study, like Hannah and Simon, from your study of what they've wrote and talked about, as a potential like solution, do you think that the solution, according to his works and vision, was like colossal mass awakenings of people, or do you also think that it's also from top down, where people in power will act with the right intentions, or do you think it's both? Probably it is both, but just wanted to get your thoughts on how you think the solution will emerge more so practically, because I think the timelines he gave were fast approaching. So it's just maybe to get your thoughts on that.
I personally think that, like you said, it's a little bit of both. Like I think it's really interesting, like having have learned about this stuff, but then also again, like reading all of Gurdjieff's books and works and understanding that he predicted this change. I think that there's really like no answer I can give you in how things will go, but I think that there is hope because there is a higher power, and I think that's important to remember. It's really easy when you look at all this depressing stuff to be like, wow, this, like, is anything good ever going to happen? But like there will be big changes no matter what, and I think we all like know and need to accept that.
Yeah, just to, as I've understood the Gayatri Parivar, it's radically inside out and radically bottom up. And so my understanding of Gurudev's focus and emphasis was coming up from the bottom. And I think that it's debatable, but there's an interesting discussion about the relationship between inside out and bottom up. And some have said that those two go together, such that if we think of things outside in, then that opens up causal pathways that we can imagine a more top-down set of solutions. But if we think of things more inside out, then we recognize that it's one person at a time, and that we're not going to be able to be saved by our politicians. That was what this is what